You talked about historical tradition, also habits of the heart and habits of the mind. But we started having written constitutions, I believe, from the first Dynamo constitution in the 1930s. And then we had another constitution thereafter by Lord Salisbury. And then thereafter many other changes. And then we had another constitution finally in 1978, which has had thus far 20 amendments, 20 odd amendments to it. So obviously we don't seem to be getting a constitutional drafting correctly, because we seem to be continuously changing it and amending it. Can you give us a quick overview of what has been wrong with all our constitutions and why there has been so many attempts to keep changing, and what really needs to be fixed? So it seems like there's a foundational issue, that something is fundamentally wrong, that we need to keep changing it so many times and amending it.
Yeah, great question. But I would place the start of our written constitutional tradition, or put it another way, the start of our constitutional modernity, a little earlier than the Dynamo Constitution, as you did. In fact, 100 years earlier than that. So our first sort of modern written constitution can be regarded as that is the Charter of Justice of 1833, otherwise known as the Colebrook-Cameron Reforms. This is a really remarkable exercise at the time. Charles Hay Cameron, the drafter of the Charter of Justice, was a Scottish barrister, by the way, who was also a great disciple and student of Jeremy Bentham, the great liberal positivist scholar at University College London. And it's very clear when you look at that work, particularly the lovely historical work, now forgotten, done by G.C. Mendes, the historian, on the Colebrook-Cameron papers. You will see that Benthamite ideas are fully, being put into practice in the drafting. And here it's ideas of liberal imperialism of the 19th century, which is that imperialism, the British Empire was not simply a process of creating markets for British goods and for extracting raw materials from the empire, but it was also a civilizing mission. I mean, these are not popular things these days, but that was how it was. It was very much part of that approach that Cameron certainly adopted, and you could see how he criticized the dictatorial, autocratic powers of the British governor. He wanted to get rid of the military command, the garrison commander of Colombo, straight out from government. He wanted to establish the separation of powers. He wanted to buttress the independence of the judiciary so that the common law can develop as it had in England for 900 years. So it was seen as from the mores and the values of that time as very much a progressive thing to do. And Ceylon, in that sense, from 1833 onwards, and that we've had a number of different instruments after that up until 1931 when we had Dynamo, and Dynamo was very much in that tradition as well. Ceylon was very much, and this is not controversial, colonial historians of the period would say that Ceylon was very much the constitutional laboratory of the British Empire. Whenever the Brits wanted to test out a new constitutional sort of idea, they would do it in Ceylon, because it was a small, compact, very prosperous little colony with a highly anglicized and educated elite. The ideal conditions outside of the non-white settler dominions to experiment with forms of government. And from Colebrook-Cameron onwards through to the other various reforms to Dynamo itself. Remember, Dynamo was a radical experiment at the time. Nobody in the Ceylon elite except for A.E. Gunasinghe had asked for universal franchise, but that was given anyway. Now we celebrate last year 90 years of unbroken electoral democracy. That's the legacy of the Dynamo Constitution. In all these senses, we've had that constitutional history which has been sort of really at the forefront of British constitutional thinking. What happened after independence, of course, I think, in terms of the two constitutions that we made by ourselves in 1972 and 1978, the overwhelming thing, to cut a very long story short, was this, what Dr. Neelan Tiruchelvam called the instrumental making of constitutions. That is that a party or a coalition comes into power, often with an overwhelming majority. The Samagi Peramuna in 1970, 2/3 majority. The UNP in 1977 with a 5/6 majority. And then what they do is not use that power to govern and put their program through, but they also try to change the nature of the state. And in the process, now in the 70-72 Constituent Assembly process, for example, the Tamils tried to stake out their position. They were not listened to. They walked out. And then the constitution making proceeded entirely according to the wishes of the governing majority of the day, right? So socialism, and very highly Sinhala Buddhist nationalist characteristics, like giving Sinhala the primary place, the putting in of the unitary state almost as a slap across the face of the Tamils who had asked for federalism. And all these things could be done because they had the 2/3 majority. So this instrumental use by parties in power, and the same story in 77, Jayawardena had been advocating presidentialism quite openly as a sort of fairly autocratic model of government that he thought was necessary for the rapid development of the economy. He never got the chance. He first articulated this in a speech to the Ceylon Association for the Advancement of Science in December 1966. But at that time, you will remember, the UNP was led by Dudley Senanayake, who was a very committed parliamentarist and who wanted the UNP to have nothing to do with presidentialism. But Jaya got his chance after Dudley died, and he became the leader of the UNP. And then in 77, because of the absolute catastrophe that was the socialist experiment between 70 and 77, he got his massive majority. And when he came to power, he could absolutely reshape the entire constitution according to his personal wish. And that's the 1978 constitution. So I think, yes, the reason why we have never sort of settled on a proper equilibrium is due to, one is that constitution making has been done by the party in power in the pursuit of its own interests or the interests of its leader. And the moment that you start making constitutions like that, what happens is, of course, the party in power is not the whole country. It's there is a whole other half of the country which did not vote for it, who want to have nothing to do with it. And in our case, we had a tragic 30-year conflict because of this inability to think of Sri Lanka in an inclusive way, to understand that we have different ethnic and religious groups in this country, but who are all Sri Lankans. And a constitution is not the instrument of the party in power, but has to be the governing instrument of all Sri Lankans. And this inability to negotiate and compromise and use values like prudence and moderation in negotiating a settlement that is acceptable to all, where not everybody wins, but there are sufficient winners and there are no fundamental losers out of that process. That's our problem. And that's the reason why now in the recent past, we have seen the last three parliaments have done three amendments, the 18th, 19th, and the 20th amendment. So the party in power shifting the constitution according to its own things. This is not a stable way of doing things. So I think. In due course, we will talk about presidentialism more at length and so on. But we need both a different way of doing this and as well as a different understanding of the purpose of constitution making and what a constitution is. It's not there for short-term goals like a policy of government. It is a much more broader, deeper thing. And I think we have reached a stage, and what I'm very hopeful about these protest movement that has started in Sri Lanka is that there are signs that the electorate and our society is maturing now to be able to do that. Because in the past, when ruling majorities did things to appease the majority community by giving primacy to their language and religion, they were applauded and egged on. So there was an incentive for politicians to ignore or even actively ill-treat minorities. We may be coming to a historical juncture in which the electorate and the society as a whole is maturing enough to realize that that is not a sustainable or a good way of doing things.